My name is Brian Daniels, and I'm a project supervisor for Summit Construction, one of the largest and most respected firms in the region. While my career took off, my personal life faced challenges. I met Emma, my college sweetheart, and we dated for 4 years before getting married. Emma, with her stunning auburn hair, emerald green eyes, and an infectious laugh, could light up any room. But Emma also craved stability, something my constant work travel made hard to provide. She refused to start a family until I could be home more often, a decision I respected but struggled with. Each September, Stephen is my boss hosted an extravagant company picnic. He closed the office for a long weekend and turned the event into a family-friendly carnival. Rides, games, and food. Stephen treated his employees like family, often going above and beyond to help those in need. Emma and I always attended. She was the kind of woman who turned heads, even among the roughest construction workers. While most were respectful, there was always one bad apple. This year, that apple was Jack Carson, a loudmouth who couldn't seem to keep his hands to himself during a volleyball game. When I saw him grab Emma's waist, twice, I confronted his foreman and made it clear. One more slip-up, and Jack was out of a job. Around that time, Stephen won a major road resurfacing contract about 250 miles from home. It promised a hefty bonus if completed early but came with severe penalties if we missed the deadline. I spent months managing the project, enduring long hours and extended stays on the road. This strain began to take its toll on Emma and me. She was frustrated by my absences, and I felt the weight of balancing work and marriage. But there was light at the end of the tunnel. Stephen promised that if I delivered on this project, he'd move me into the home construction division. No more overnight trips. That morning, I had a heated argument with Emma. She was upset about me leaving yet again, even for just one night. She locked me out of our bedroom, leaving me to sleep on the couch. Frustrated but determined to finish the job, I hit the road at 4 a.m. When I reached the site, I learned my foreman, Paul Mitchell, and the crew had worked through the night. The road was done. All that remained was to remove the cones and signage. Elated, I treated the entire crew to lunch, gave Paul cash for beers, and headed home earlier than expected. I called Stephen with the good news and asked Karen, our office manager, to book a 9 p.m. reservation at Luciano's, Emma's favorite restaurant. I also told her to send roses to our house and arrange a dinner for her and her husband as a thank you for their hard work. Despite traffic delays that set me back an hour, I pulled into the driveway at 8:30 p.m. The house was dark, and Emma wasn't home. Seeing the bouquet on the table, but no note from her felt strange. Emma always called if she went out without me. Assuming she'd return soon, I hopped in the shower, dressed, and prepared for a romantic evening. When I realized that dinner plans were ruined, I called to cancel the reservation. It stung a little, but I figured the celebration would have to wait. Resigned, I grabbed a cold beer and threw together a quick sandwich. As I sat at the kitchen table, polishing off the last bite, I heard something, a distinct noise coming from the garage. A voice followed, low and unmistakably male. My pulse quickened. That voice didn't belong to my dad, and we weren't expecting anyone. I've always carried a 9mm Ruger for personal protection, a habit from years of traveling through remote areas for work. I'd put it back on before heading out for dinner, as I felt uneasy leaving the house without it. Instinctively, I drew my weapon, flicked off the safety, and moved toward the sound. My heart pounded as the door leading from the garage creaked open. A man's silhouette loomed in the dim light, framed in the entrance to the laundry room. In the heat of the moment, my training took over. I aimed at the figure's center mass and fired 3 rapid shots. The loud cracks echoed through the house, followed by the dull thud of a body hitting the floor. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone to dial 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice grounded me. I just shot an intruder, I said, my own voice shaking. He entered my home unannounced. The body is in the laundry room. He's not moving. Just as I was relaying this, I heard a scream from the garage. It wasn't just any scream. It was Emma. My stomach twisted into knots as I told the operator about the scream and that my wife seemed to be nearby. She assured me that both police and paramedics were en route. I bolted to the garage, desperate to find Emma and make sure she was okay. When I saw her, I felt a wave of relief and concern. "Babe, are you all right?" I asked, my voice tight with worry. Her reaction, however, was like a punch to the gut. She screamed at me, her face pale and contorted with shock. "You murdered him. You killed him." Before I could respond, she turned and fled upstairs, slamming our bedroom door shut. Confused and shaken, I returned to the laundry room and looked at the body for the first time. My heart sank as I recognized the lifeless face of Jack Carson, the same man who'd caused trouble at the company picnic. What the hell was going on? I didn't have much time to process before the police arrived. I called my dad, relaying the bare facts of what had happened. "Stay calm and don't say anything," he advised firmly. "I will be soon there," said my dad. Following standard procedure, I unloaded the Ruger, removed the chambered round, and placed the weapon on the kitchen table with the magazine beside it. I tried one last time to get Emma to come out of the bedroom. "Emma, we need to talk," I pleaded. "What's going on? Why was Jack Carson here?" But she didn't answer. Something about the situation reeked of betrayal. I was still standing in the kitchen when the police burst in, guns drawn and shouting commands. "Hands up! Where's the weapon?" "I'm unarmed," I said, raising my hands. The guns on the table, unloaded. I complied with every order as they cuffed me. At that moment, Dad and Ben, as my friend, arrived. Emma chose that moment to reappear, her voice trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear. "He murdered him. He killed Jack," she cried. The officers escorted her to the kitchen for questioning, while Ben calmly told me to remain silent. "Let them do their investigation," he said. Despite my mounting confusion, I followed his advice. Soon after, the officers decided to take me to the station, pending further investigation. The next 72 hours were a nightmare. At the precinct, I learned the full extent of the accusations. Emma had claimed that Carson was a friend she had invited over and insisted that I had killed him out of jealousy. According to her, I must have somehow found out about their friendship, misinterpreted it, and acted in a jealous rage. Based on her statement, I was charged with capital murder. Being processed was a surreal and humiliating experience. Fingerprinted, photographed, and booked into the county detention center. On the advice of Ben, I kept my mouth shut. The betrayal cut deep. How could Emma do this to me? I never suspected she and Jack Carson were involved, let alone that she'd turn against me so completely. The next morning, I was interviewed again after consulting with Ben. He made it clear we would invoke the Defend the Homestead statute. I explained that, as trained, I shot at what I believed to be an advancing intruder who entered my home unannounced. There was no time to identify the person or assess their intent. It was pure self-defense. Ben filed for bail, arguing my strong ties to the community and lack of a criminal record. But in this county, capital cases rarely, if ever, received bail. I was remanded to jail to await trial, a process that dragged on for a grueling 21 months. During that time, I learned that the district attorney, Stephanie Campton, was confident she had an airtight case. She viewed Emma as a cooperative eyewitness, even though the law couldn't compel her to testify against me. Emma, however, seemed more than willing to take the stand. She cut off all communication with me, refusing to hear my side of the story. Dad and Ben stepped in to support me. They hired Frank Allen, a high-powered criminal attorney with a reputation for saving high-profile clients from serious charges. In our first meeting, I laid everything bare. I had no idea Emma and Jack Carson were involved, and at the time, I believed him to be a trespasser. I had acted instinctively, as I was trained to do. Frank listened carefully, his sharp eyes betraying no emotion, and began to outline our defense strategy. I explained to Frank that I feared for my life that night. I had no idea who had entered my home, and I certainly didn't know that he was an invited guest of my wife. She hadn't left me any notification of her plans or whereabouts since the early afternoon. Calls to both her cell phone and our home line went unanswered, and my voice messages had gone ignored. I added that Emma couldn't have witnessed the shooting because she was in the garage when the shots were fired. It wasn't until I heard her scream that I even realized she was nearby. She knew I carried a handgun for protection, I told him. I laid out the events of the evening, finishing the job ahead of schedule, canceling our dinner reservation because she hadn't been home in time, and sitting down to eat a sandwich while waiting for her return. That's when Jack entered the house, alone, in near total darkness. She should have seen my car in the garage and known I was home, I said. But there was no warning. I admitted to Frank that I'd had a single beer with my sandwich before the shooting. I also told him about the tension in my marriage, Emma's displeasure with my frequent travel, and the argument that ended with her locking me out of our bedroom just days earlier. Then there was the company picnic incident with Jack, the only time I'd ever had an issue with him. She brushed him off, so I didn't think much of it after that, I explained. And while I did warn his supervisor to keep him in line, I didn't have the authority to fire him. That would have been up to my boss. Frank listened carefully, taking meticulous notes. "You've done well to tell me everything," he said, his tone reassuring. "But prepare yourself. The DA will likely offer you a plea deal. My advice? Don't take it. This case isn't the slam dunk she thinks it is." His confidence gave me a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. Frank, backed by my dad's unwavering support, hired a team of private investigators to dig into every aspect of Jack and Emma's relationship. With my consent, they searched my home, our cars, and any other potential sources of evidence. Frank left no stone unturned, and over the next 21 months, he built a robust defense. During my time in jail, I struggled with the overwhelming betrayal. I didn't want to believe Emma had been unfaithful, but the evidence was damning. Witnesses came forward, testifying that they'd seen Emma and Jack out together while I was away, touching, kissing, and acting in ways no married woman should. Security footage surfaced of them entering his apartment together and engaging in lewd acts in a bar parking lot. One clip showed her overt actions on him in plain view of the camera. The humiliation and heartbreak were unbearable, but my parents were my lifeline. Without their support, I'm not sure how I would have survived. On June 4th, 2024, my trial officially began. The district attorney, Stefan, opened with a damning narrative. She painted a picture of a love triangle gone wrong, claiming I had used our state's Defend the Homestead law as an excuse to eliminate a man I saw as a threat to my marriage. She described Emma as a loving wife who had maintained an innocent friendship with Jack, nothing warranting the violent outcome that unfolded. Mrs. Emma volunteered to testify for the state, a decision she made of her own volition, said Judge. Her testimony will show that while her friendship with Jack may have been unconventional, it was far from sexual. She will attest that, had her husband expressed concern, she would have ended the friendship immediately. But instead, my husband chose violence, a choice that cost Jack his life. Frank's opening statement struck a very different tone. He systematically dismantled the prosecution's narrative, focusing on Emma's credibility, or lack thereof. "The evidence will reveal the truth," he began. Not only was Mrs. Emma engaged in a clandestine sexual affair with the victim, but her testimony about what happened that night is riddled with lies and speculation. Frank explained that Emma had been in the garage when the shots were fired, cleaning up after overt actions on Jack. From that position, she couldn't have witnessed the shooting. "She has fabricated her version of events to align with her own interests," Frank asserted. He also pointed out that I had no knowledge of the affair and had acted in self-defense against what I believed to be an intruder. Frank emphasized the glaring lack of communication from Emma on the night in question. "There was no note, no message, no text, nothing to alert my client of her plans," Frank said. "The evidence will show that Mrs. Emma's testimony is not only unreliable but motivated by a desire to protect her own image." He promised to expose the full extent of her deceit. The prosecution began by entering my Ruger into evidence, along with the 3 spent shell casings. A forensic expert testified that the gun was legally registered to me, and both my fingerprints and DNA were found on it. She confirmed that gunshot residue was consistent with recent use, and that the ballistic evidence matched 2 of the slugs recovered from Jack's body. The coroner then took the stand, stating that Jack had died from 3 gunshot wounds to the chest. 2 9mm bullets were recovered intact, 1 from his heart. The third was too fragmented to analyze but consistent with the weapon used. Detective James testified about his investigation. He detailed Emma's account of the events, her claim that Jack was an invited guest, and her assertion that I had threatened Jack's job out of jealousy. He confirmed that I had invoked the Defend the Homestead Law during questioning and had no prior knowledge of the victim's identity. When Frank cross-examined Detective, he zeroed in on the detective's reliance on Emma's testimony. Without Mrs. Emma's statement, would you have charged my client with capital murder? He asked. Detective hesitated. I don't believe so, he admitted. I would have needed more time to investigate. Frank's strategy was working. He had planted seeds of doubt. But the real challenge lay ahead. Emma herself was the prosecution's star witness. Her betrayal, both personal and public, loomed like a storm cloud over my defense. That night, as the judge adjourned for the day, I sat alone in my cell, replaying every moment of my life with Emma. How had it come to this? I lay on the hard bunk, unable to sleep, bracing myself for what would come next. The following morning, after a breakfast of cold oatmeal and bitter coffee, I was shackled, dressed, and transported to the courthouse. Frank met me in the holding cell. Today's going to be tough, he said, his voice steady but firm. Emma's testimony is key for the prosecution. I'm going to tear it apart, but you need to stay composed. No emotion, no reaction. Let me handle it. At 9 a.m., court was back in session. Emma took the stand. The jury was seated, and Judge entered the courtroom. Judge was a respected figure known for his sharp legal acumen and unwavering commitment to fairness and due process. His courtroom was a place of solemnity, and no one dared challenge the sanctity of his proceedings or the rule of law. The tension was palpable as the prosecutor rose to call her star witness. Emma, my wife, took the stand, swore an oath, and prepared to give her version of the events. I sat in the defendant's chair, doing my best to remain stoic, though every fiber of my being wanted to cry out at the betrayal I had endured. Prosecutor began with a gentle tone, asking Emma to take her time. Her voice trembled as she recounted her story, occasionally choking up. She admitted to seeing Jack for about 2 weeks before. She explained that it all started at a company costume party, which I couldn't attend because I was out of town for work. Angry at my absence, Emma decided to go alone. Jack had approached her at the party, and although she initially rebuffed him, her anger and alcohol consumption that evening clouded her judgment. According to Emma, Jack plied her with drinks throughout the night, and as her inhibitions waned, she finally agreed to dance with him. When the party ended, Jack offered to drive her home. Once there, he kissed her. She claimed she tried to resist but ultimately gave in due to her inebriated state. She insisted nothing beyond kissing happened that night. Over the next 2 weeks, Jack called or visited whenever I was out of town. Emma admitted she found him attractive and had grown increasingly frustrated with my frequent absences. She invited Jack to our home, assuming I would still be away for work. She claimed they were entering the house together when 3 shots rang out, leaving Jack lifeless in a pool of blood. Overcome with fear, Emma said she ran upstairs, locked herself in the bedroom, and called 911, believing I had intentionally murdered her friend. Prosecutor concluded her questioning, and it was now Frank's turn to cross-examine. Frank rose deliberately, his calm demeanor masking the intensity of his strategy. He recapped Emma's testimony and asked if she understood the penalties for perjury. Emma hesitated, then nodded. Please answer verbally, Mrs. Emma, Frank said, his voice firm. Yes, Emma replied softly. Do you have anything you'd like to add before we continue? Frank asked. No, she whispered. Frank's next question cut straight to the core. Mrs. Emma, did you perform sucking on Jack in his truck outside your home after he drove you from the party you attended earlier that evening? Remember, you're under oath. Emma's face crumpled. Yes, she admitted meekly. Frank didn't let up. Did you also sucking on Mr. Jack in the parking lot of Revolution's nightclub on November 29th in your car parked outside the Starlight Lounge and again in your garage just before the shooting took place? Emma began to weep, shaking her head before burying her face in her hands. Frank pressed her for an answer. Yes, she finally admitted through her tears. Frank requested permission to treat Emma as a hostile witness. Judge granted the request and reminded Emma of her obligation to answer truthfully. Failure to comply will result in contempt of court, and you'll be remanded to county jail. Is that clear, Mrs.? Yes, Your Honor, she said, her voice barely audible. Frank continued. Did you have more with Mr. Jack, Mrs. Emma? No, Julia said vehemently. Yet you visited his apartment on several occasions. Did you ever spend the night there? No, never, she insisted. Frank raised an eyebrow. So you're certain that during those visits, you never had more with Mr. Emma? Yes, I'm certain. It was only sucking. I never had more with him, Emma replied. Frank moved to his next line of questioning. Mrs., you admitted to performing sucking in your garage before the shooting. Isn't it true that you were cleaning your car seat when the fatal shots were fired? And isn't it also true that you never checked your messages, where you would have discovered that your husband was returning home that evening? Emma hesitated, but finally said, yes, that's true. Frank drove the point home. Wasn't it your intention to have Jack spend the night because you had decided to escalate your affair? After more hesitation, Emma finally admitted, yes. Frank methodically laid out the facts. Emma's repeated infidelity, her deliberate deception, and her failure to check for any communication from me. He concluded with a pointed question. Given all of this, Mrs., how can you be certain my client shot Jack with premeditation and malice when, by your own admission, you couldn't even see the shooting? Emma paused. It's possible he didn't, she said reluctantly. Would you say it's even probable? Frank pushed. Objection, prosecutor shouted, rising to her feet. Before the judge could rule, Frank withdrew the question. No further questions, Your Honor, he said calmly. The DA looked rattled as she rested her case. Judge called for a recess until 12 p.m. During the break, I was escorted to a conference room where Frank, Mom, and Dad were waiting. They brought me a club sandwich, which I devoured. Frank outlined the plan for the afternoon. A series of character witnesses to testify on my behalf, along with the video evidence and witness statements that would further discredit Emma. When court resumed, Frank called a parade of witnesses who testified to my reputation as a fair, level-headed man and a respected supervisor. Paul Mitchell, Jack's foreman, testified about my handling of the picnic incident, emphasizing that I had requested Jack be warned, not fired, for his behavior. Paul also detailed my enthusiasm upon learning the project was completed, my generosity in treating the crew to lunch, and my plans to celebrate with Julia. Next, Kate, our office manager, recounted how ecstatic I'd been when I called to arrange a last-minute dinner reservation at Emma's favorite restaurant. She described ordering champagne and flowers for the occasion and confirmed my plans to surprise Emma with the good news. Frank then entered the video footage into evidence, along with testimony from witnesses who had seen Emma and Jack together. The damning evidence painted a clear picture of her duplicity. At 4 p.m., Frank rested our case. Judge called for a recess and scheduled closing arguments for the following morning. I sat back, exhausted but hopeful that the truth was finally emerging. That night, I was shackled and returned to my cell at the county jail. After forcing down the inedible slop they called dinner, I lay on my bunk, staring at the cracked ceiling. My entire future would soon be decided, and though I felt Frank had done an excellent job in my defense, doubts still gnawed at the edges of my mind. Could it possibly be enough? Exhaustion finally overtook me, pulling me into a restless sleep filled with fragmented dreams of freedom and betrayal. The next morning, DA delivered her closing arguments. DA reiterated her case, stating that while much of the evidence was circumstantial, there were simply too many coincidences to dismiss. DA argued that any reasonable person could see the shooting of Jack was a deliberate and calculated act, a plot to permanently remove my wife's lover from the picture. DA urged the jury to return a verdict of guilty of capital murder, insisting the evidence left no room for reasonable doubt. But as I listened, it was clear DA confidence had waned. DA avoided mentioning Emma's testimony entirely, an omission that even I could see meant trouble for her case. Frank had effectively dismantled Emma's credibility and painted me as a victim of tragic circumstances. The slam-dunk case DA had envisioned at the trial's start was now riddled with holes. When it was Frank's turn, he delivered a powerful closing argument. He highlighted the sloppy police work and the prosecution's reliance on a witness who had proven unreliable. He emphasized how the evidence supported my version of events, that I had acted out of fear, defending my life and home from what I believed was an intruder. The prosecution's case, Frank declared, has more holes than a block of Swiss cheese. The circumstantial evidence supports my client's innocence, not guilt. Enough reasonable doubt exists, and I urge you to do the only just thing. Acquit my client of this charge." He ended by acknowledging the tragedy of the situation. Jack's death was both tragic and avoidable, but my client was simply protecting himself in his own home. That is not murder. The jury began deliberating at 10 a.m. Hours crawled by as I waited in the conference room, my heart pounding with every tick of the clock. At 3:45 p.m., I was escorted back to the courtroom. The jury filed and shortly after, followed by Judge, who called the court to order at 4:02 p.m. "Madam Foreman, have you reached a verdict?" Judge Hughes asked. The jury foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." The courtroom fell silent as she read the decision. "In the matter of capital murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." Relief flooded through me as the weight of 21 months of fear and uncertainty lifted. Judge thanked the jury for their service before addressing me directly. "Mr. I recommend that you seek counseling to help you cope with the stress of taking a life, even if it was justified," he said. "The circumstances were tragic and unforeseeable, and I hope you find peace and stability moving forward. You are hereby remanded to the county jail for immediate outprocessing and release." I barely registered his words as they processed me out and returned my belongings. I left wearing the suit I had worn to court, leaving everything else behind for other inmates to use. Mom and Dad were waiting outside the Sallyport, and the moment I saw them, I felt like I could finally breathe again. That night, I ate real food, had an ice-cold beer, and slept in a comfortable bed. Tomorrow, I would celebrate, but the day after that, I would mourn all that had been lost. The celebration the next day was small but heartfelt. Family and friends gathered for first-rate barbecue and plenty of beer. Emma, unsurprisingly, was absent. While I was glad to be free, my thoughts lingered on how much had been lost. The next weeks were a blur of recovery. I took time to adjust, retreating to our family cabin on Lake Wallace for solitude. Fishing became my therapy. One stormy afternoon, as I returned from the lake to escape an unexpected downpour, I found Emma sitting on the cabin's sofa. She looked frail, her tear-streaked face and emaciated frame telling a story of regret and pain. When she saw me, she froze like a deer in headlights. A clap of thunder shook the cabin, and Emma bolted toward me, wrapping her arms around me. Instinctively, I held her until her trembling subsided. When the storm passed, I asked, "Why are you here, Emma?" Her apology came, but it was too little, too late. I laid everything bare. The betrayal, the lies, the fact that she had tried to destroy me. "Love was never involved in your choices," I told her. "The next time I see you will be in court." Divorce court. Emma's guilt drove her to a breaking point. Not long after, she attempted suicide by jumping off the Delton River Bridge, but I happened to be nearby in my boat and rescued her. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Let us know in the comments. She survived and entered a court-mandated psychiatric program, spending 7 months in treatment. Therapy helped her confront her actions and their consequences, but it couldn't repair the damage she had done. We divorced amicably, though it was the hardest chapter of my life. Today, life is better. I've taken over the home division at work and was promoted to vice president last year. My parents, who stood by me through everything, received the gift they deserved: a trip around the world for Christmas. As for me, I've met someone new, Anna, a divorced woman with her own trust issues. While we're taking things slow, I feel a spark. For now, I'm focused on rebuilding myself, one step at a time. Whether I'm ready for love again remains uncertain, but one thing is clear: the storm has passed, and the horizon looks brighter.